Chapter 3 Students and Rogues. Asterisk bedroom, 19 Hyoto Lane, Kuo Town. Asterisk Issei lay sprawled out on his bed. He had spent the morning with the Occult Research Club, and Rias had taught him many of the things he would need to know as an associate of her peerage, for all intents and purposes an additional member of her peerage. She covered off the functions of the different evil pieces and the positions of her other members. Aquino held the title of her queen, which gave her enhanced magic, strength and speed beyond those of a regular devil. It also meant that she was the closest advisor of Rias, her confidant and clearly also her best friend. Next was Kiba, her only knight. His position allowed him tactical flexibility and speed comparable of a queen. Lastly was Kaneko, her rook. Strength was the main area of her enhancement as far as Issei could tell. Rias didn't have any bishops or pawns, however had explained that bishops received a potent increase to magical capability and that pawns were given less outright capability in favor of being flexible. Issei himself would be a unique case as he wasn't technically a part of her evil piece set and yet filled all the positions of her key piece set. She had no idea if the pieces he held would enhance him in the manner that they had for a devil, but had told him that she would find out for him. Issei had accepted that. There was nothing else he could do about it until she did. Rias had then proceeded to explain how each member of peerage served a job within a system assigned to her by devil hierarchy and how the profits of the jobs carried out by each member, including herself, were what funded the other activities of her group. Rias also explained the responsibilities that had been assigned to her and thus to her peerage as well, mainly to ensure that no rogue supernatural beings harmed the humans of the town of Kuo, which was under her jurisdiction, so to speak. As she spoke of protecting the people of Kuo, she had apologized to Issei for what had befallen him. She felt that his injuries had reflected badly on her ability to uphold her duties and that he would view her as less than capable, but he waved off her concerns while reassuring her with a smile that he held no ill will or judgment of her abilities against her. Finally, Rias explained some aspects of devil society to Issei, the nature of their immortality, ability to see in the dark, natural affinity for the night and their vastly enhanced endurance in comparison to humans. All in all, Issei was inundated with information. After lunch, Issei had returned to his normal classes and then returned home once the day was over. There was no need for him to stay back with the Occult Research Club after school, seeing as he had spent the whole morning with them. Issei entered his home and his stomach growled loudly at him. He would love to eat now, but he had chores to do before he could prepare and eat dinner. His parents didn't return home until late, and so Issei took care of the housework and cooked his own dinner during the week. It was only the weekend when he got to spend a large amount of time with his family. After completing all of his housework, Issei went to his bedroom and did all the homework that had been assigned to him that day before returning to the kitchen to cook himself up a small banquet. He demolished the meal just as he had his breakfast, cleaned up the dishes and showered, once again ensuring he was careful so as to not catch his sensitive tail. He then lay on his bed wearing a pair of green tracksuit pants and a white singlet. He wanted to wear as loose-fitting clothes as he could after the discomfort of his almost unbearably tight uniform all day. As he lay on his bed playing games on his phone, Issei felt a discomfort in his body. His whole body felt restless, as if it needed to be moving. He didn't know any effective way to get rid of this feeling though. It wasn't something he had ever dealt with before. He attempted to ignore the urges that ran through him, but they only built. Before long he had grown fed up with the gnawing irritation and decided to see if Drake would have a solution to the problem. Closing his eyes, he concentrated on his breathing, feeling the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. He opened his eyes to the vast, endless white abyss that he had experienced the previous 2 nights. It seemed to be becoming easier to enter this realm within his mind. Drake lay curled up in what appeared to be a deep sleep as Issei approached him. Issei approached confidently without attempting to be overly quiet. He expected the large dragon to move, however he remained still. Issei assumed that he was in a deep slumber, and so as he got close he reached out to touch the scales of the great beast. "Don't you know it's folly to touch a sleeping dragon?" Drake growled as he opened his left eye, peering directly at Issei. Issei stood sheepishly with his hand mere millimeters from the dragon before returning it to his side and muttering an apology. Drake chortled at Issei's embarrassment and asked him why he had come to visit. "My body feels restless." Exceedingly so, and I have no idea how to resolve this. It is driving me insane, figuratively speaking, he told the powerful dragon. The great dragon nodded his massive head as Issei spoke. Well, of course you are restless. Your saiyan blood demands that you seek out a fight, but when that is not available it will demand you train to become stronger. Drake informed Issei, once again assuming his air of the wise and all-knowing sage. Again Issei felt that excited thrill to grow stronger and develop that seemed to have awoken within him the night he first woke up in this realm. However, it also frustrated the boy as he voiced his irritation. I don't know how to train though. Issei grumbled simply. Drake laughed outright at Issei's statement. His great rolling laughter reverberating around the enclosure of this place. I can help you there, young one. Watch this. Drake stated happily. After he spoke he exhaled a plume of smoke from his snout, and as it cleared a dull green essence floated in the air like a will-o-wisp or floating lantern. This, Drake began indicating to the floating mass, is a preserved memory from the saiyan warriors of old. Simply touch it and you should absorb the knowledge of those who came before you. Issei reached out his hand toward the ethereal mass, his hand moved through it, and yet as it did so, images began flashing before Issei's eyes at an alarming rate. It was too much information and he whipped his hand out of the mass. His lungs heaving as he did so. He felt as if he had just run a marathon. You must focus on one image. Hold it and then you will be able to absorb it without being overloaded. Drake advised in a tone that made it clear that he felt that information was obvious. Why couldn't he have told Issei that before he tried? Issei shook the thought from his mind and prepared to try again. Issei controlled his breathing with deep even breaths and calmed his racing heart. His hand reached out and touched the mass again. The images began bombarding him once more and he chose one at random. He held the image with all his willpower and the others faded away. As the image became crystal clear, Issei felt himself falling forward. Within a heartbeat he was in the image. In the memory. He stood in an open field. Thick woodland encroached on the north and western sides. A long dirt road intersected from south to east. The sun beat down harshly against the ground, creating a stifling heat. Despite this, with the clear sky and mild breeze, the area was pleasant. But the scenery was not what Issei had come to witness. On the field stood 3 figures and 2 objects. 2 boys and an old man. The old man wore an orange Hawaiian-style collared shirt and cargo shorts. In his right hand rested an aging long, twisted and warped-stained oaken cane. A pair of sunglasses covered his eyes and the lower half of his face was hidden behind a white beard. His bald head shone in the sunlight. He stood before the 2 boys like a sensei to a class. The first boy was bald like the old man, with 6 odd small dots marked on his forehead like a playing dice. He wore a yellow karate gi with red pants, brown boots, and a black belt. The next boy had wild black hair that stuck out at weird angles. He wore a white tank top, blue pants with a light blue belt, black shoes, and red wristbands, but what caught Issei's attention was his tail. It was black like the boy's hair and protruded from his lower back in the same manner as Issei's. The boy was a saiyan. Issei smiled deeply. This is what he had wanted to see, how a saiyan was trained. The old man began to speak, but Issei couldn't hear a word of it. It was as if the memory had been muted. Audio file not found, so to speak. Issei observed as the old man indicated for the boys to move to the 2 objects. Each object was a dome in shape. A giant shell with a hollow cavity carved out on the inside. Straps and buckles crossed over the cavity. The outside was covered in octagonal shapes. Issei realized that they were the shells of giant turtles or tortoise. The boys approached the shells and attempted to lift them. Eventually, with great difficulty, the boys were able to lift and strap the shells onto their own backs. Once the boys were all strapped up, they began their training regime under the watchful eye of their master. They conducted push-ups, jumping jacks, and shuttle runs to begin with. After what seemed to Issei to be a few hours, the boys stopped and the old man began running down the lane. The boys and Issei followed. Issei approximated that they had followed the man for 3 miles before they reached a quaint little town. 2 new men greeted the group as they approached. The old man returned the greeting and indicated to the young boys. The men nodded with broad smirks across their faces. Each boy moved to a man and they handed them an object. The bald boy was handed a sack. Issei looked in the sack and saw that it contained vegetable seeds of some sort. The saiyan boy was handed a dozen stacks of milk bottles, all piled one on top of the other. The boys nodded to each other and then ran off in different directions as fast as they could. First Issei followed the saiyan boy. The boy was delivering milk while still wearing the turtle shell. He delivered as fast as he could but was careful to ensure no harm came to the glass bottles. Judging by the heavy sweat the boy rapidly gained, Issei could tell it was a brutal workout. Leaving the boy halfway through his chore, Issei went to the local fields where he saw the other boy digging up the ground and planting all the seeds by hand. No tools used at all. Like the saiyan boy, he was working as fast and carefully as possible, ensuring that each seed was properly buried before moving on. Both boys worked at a blistering pace and it became clear to Issei that they were competing rivals. As luck would have it, both made it back to their master at the same time and collapsed at his feet in pure exhaustion. Neither made a move to remove the turtle shell though. Issei wondered what they would do next, but the scenery began to blur and distort. A feeling of floating upward overtook Issei and before he knew it he was back in the void of his mind. Issei felt the white ground return under him and turned to Drake. The great dragon spoke before Issei could. "Did it work, young one?" his question filled with both concern and interest. Issei looked at him puzzled for a moment before answering. "Well, yeah, of course, I was in there for what felt like a whole day," his voice flat as he replied. "To me it seemed as if less than a second passed from you placing your hand in the memory and then you're turning back toward me." Drake stated plainly. He then continued. "Did you learn anything useful?" Issei smiled broadly at the dragon and proceeded to tell him of everything he had witnessed. He also mentioned his suspicion that the old man was conditioning and strengthening the boys before their martial arts training was to begin. It made sense to Issei that someone was to be made stronger before something as in-depth as martial arts could be taught. After all, it was how sporting teams trained. Drake agreed with Issei's assumption and stated that he had something that would help Issei train himself here in the void of his mind. Issei frowned for a second. How would training here assist him? He looked at Drake and the dragon read the question straight off of his face. "While you are here, your body is sleeping and resting," he began, "but every exertion, every muscle you work here will strengthen that same muscle on your body in the physical world. Furthermore, while here you are able to connect with your dormant reserves of ki more easily. This will build bonds in the vast pools of ki reserves within you as well as deepen those same reserves. Therefore, training here will always produce far greater benefits than any training conducted whilst you are awake." The dragon ended his explanation with a snort that stated simply he was correct and Issei should not argue otherwise. Issei thought on it and spoke up a question that came directly to mind. "But how could I effectively train here? I have no roads to run along, no mountains to climb, nor things to lift, or push or pull." He spoke with a voice that sounded heavily of hindered aspiration. Drake looked at Issei as if he were an idiot. He held the look toward the young scion until Issei became frustrated with him and almost yelled at the dragon. "What? You know something. What is it?" Drake huffed at Issei's indignant voice, but let him off without reprimand. His tone of voice was sharp, however, to show his displeasure at being spoken to in such a manner. "This is your mind, Issei Hayadu. If you want mountains or roads, or things to push, pull, lift and throw, then just think of them. Concentrate and they shall appear, child." He spoke the last word with a tone of voice that said Issei really should have realized all this himself. Issei pondered on what he had been told and then apologized to Drake for his outburst. Drake nodded in response but offered no further input. Issei was going to ask how best to make things appear but realized he should figure this out for himself. He also knew that it would probably be not much different to traveling into this void or grasping onto a memory of the past, as in both so far had required a clear and calm mind with dedicated concentration, so that is what he did. Issei closed his eyes and thought of a hillside that he had visited on a family vacation as a young boy. He thought of the way the wind moved the trees, the smell of the plants and the touch of the grass, the scratches and scuffs of the dirt under his feet. He felt a change in the warmth of the void around him. The ki that filled the air seemed to shift slightly. It was at that thought that Issei realized that he could now in fact feel the rough dirt under his own bare feet. Opening his eyes, he was there, standing at the base of a tall hill with a winding track leading all the way to the top. Wild flowers grew sporadically. A cool breeze moved the flowers to and fro while breaking up the calming warmth of the ki permeating the air. Issei looked at Drake and the dragon spoke 5 simple words, "Now it is my turn." The moment the dragon finished speaking, a large set of bright red plate armor appeared in the air and dropped to the ground at Issei's feet with the dull thunk of very heavy metal pressing down into the soft earth beneath his feet. Issei understood immediately what the dragon intended. This armor was to be his turtle shell. The armor was a vibrant red in color. It consisted of many thick plates and had an almost futuristic quality to it, like that of a sleek robot. Large green orbs sat on the chest and shoulder guards in the same color as Drake's eyes. The colors of the armor matched those of Drake himself, and it was plain to Issei that this was a deliberate choice of the dragon. Issei began to lift, fit, and strap the armor onto himself. It was heavy, incredibly so. Once he was done, he looked to Drake and smirked before fitting the helmet on. Now fully decked out in the armor, Issei began to walk up the track of the hill. Each step was heavy beyond belief, but it wasn't enough to sate the restlessness he felt. His walk became a jog, and then that too became a run. A slow run, but still a run nonetheless. It was exhausting. The weight of the heavy metal plates combined with the hill was sapping his strength at an alarming rate, but Issei was not going to stop. He was not going to slow down, and he sure as hell wasn't going to walk again or stop his exertions. Time passed as he continued up the hill, his leg muscles burning with each step he ran. At least an hour passed before he reached the top. He stopped running and felt the wave of both exhaustion and relief that his body felt, but he couldn't stop training now. The boys in the memory didn't stop, and so neither would he. Without much knowledge of training, he simply dropped forward to the ground and performed a push-up, pausing mere millimeters from the ground but not allowing any of his weight to rest on the ground, the effort remaining entirely on his arms and chest. As his body came back up with his arms fully extended, he brought his feet to his hands and jumped in the air, clapping as he did so. When his feet reached the ground, he dropped back down into the push-up position and repeated the process. He did these movements until his arms, shoulders, and core muscles screamed foul murder at him. It had been an exercise that he had seen soldiers performing in an old war movie, and it was meant to be far more difficult than regular push-ups. He now knew why. As Issei took a short breather, he spotted a large rock, or small boulder as it would be. He moved over to it and decided to see if he could lift it. It was something he would never have been able to do as a regular boy. He bent into a squat and placed his hands under the lip of the rock. As he stood with great exertion, the rock rose with him and soon he held it above his head. Issei wasn't sure how much the rock weighed, but it would have easily been in excess of 100 kilograms. He then lowered it to his chest and then pressed it back into the sky. Shoulder presses with a boulder, so to speak. He reached 46 repetitions before he could sustain the weight of the rock no longer. However, he lowered it to the ground gently, just as the boys had done with the milk bottles and seeds. His legs had recovered somewhat whilst he conducted all his other activities, and so Issei proceeded to run back down the hill. As he reached the bottom, he circled around Drake and began running back up the hill. Upon reaching the top, he went back to doing as many get-ups as he could until he could do no more. Once they were complete and he felt that he would collapse, he continued with the boulder presses. Issei then went back down and up the mountain once more to continue it all before collapsing at the dragon's feet on his third time down the hill. I must say I am quite impressed. You have been at it for over 6 hours. Drake's voice sounding genuine. Issei merely nodded as he stretched out on the ground. Every single muscle in his entire body ached. Every damn one. Issei looked to Drake and gave the thumbs up before waving. The dragon tilted his head in reply. Issei closed his eyes and concentrated on going back to his sleeping body. It took less effort than last time, maybe because his exhaustion only let him focus on one thing. Maybe because he was getting better at it. When he opened his eyes, he was in his room and he felt refreshed and ready to take on the world. Had he even slept? He couldn't tell. He had laid down on his bed at just before 9 the previous night, and now it was almost 6 in the morning. Had he been awake that whole time in his mindscape, so to speak? He thought about it for a moment and realized that he had been conscious since he first awoke after being attacked by Yuma, but if going into his mind worked like lucid sleeping, then he decided not to worry about it. He felt completely refreshed again, just as he had the 2 previous mornings, and more importantly, he had achieved something through the night. It was a win-win situation if ever there was to be one. Issei slid out of bed and began getting ready for the day. He didn't know if he was imagining it or not, but he already felt stronger. A sly smirk spread across his face. He had gotten stronger whilst sleeping. He could achieve a lot if he did that every night. He showered, dressed, and made his way downstairs for breakfast. His tail once again being used as a belt for his clothes. It was a bit later than when he usually came to breakfast, and so his parents had already left. Such the life of people in the middle management levels of the corporate world. Always working so as to pursue that next rung of the ladder. Issei ate everything that had been left by his mother. She usually overcooked breakfast, but now with his appetite at close to 7-fold what it had been, there would never be such a thing as leftovers. During the school day, the lessons seemed to drag on and pass as slowly as possible. With each passing minute he became more excited to return to the Occult Research Club and find out what Rias had in store for him. She had said he would be getting his first assignment today, and while the prospect of work may bore some, the idea of doing devil work excited Issei. He had no idea what it could be, and he was sure whatever it was would be exhilarating. Initially he had worried that it would be something untoward, yet after voicing his concern to Rias she had laughed it off before explaining the relation of heaven and hell to earth. That Grigori, or fallen angels in lay terms, and demons of the abyss were what would be considered classically evil, while devils of hell and angels of heaven were just like any other person. It had been an odd discussion, and Issei admitted to feeling that perhaps he was receiving biased information from the beautiful red-haired devil, but decided to trust her until proven otherwise. She had saved his life, so in his mind she deserved that much. The bell for lunch rang and Issei began making his way to the cafeteria when a hand touched his left shoulder. Issei turned and found Kiba standing with Kaneko next to him. Kiba smiled at Issei whilst Kaneko kept a neutral expression but did sniff at the air in a way that made Issei's tail pulse in sympathy pain. "Are you coming to eat lunch with us?" Kiba asked. Issei was taken aback. He never ate lunch with anyone. He smiled back to Kiba and nodded. It would be nice to eat with others. The group made their way to the old building at the back of the school grounds. Issei learned from Kiba that it used to be part of the old school buildings before a fire destroyed most of them, and the new school buildings were built to replace them. Now it was in the property of the Gremory family, and as such had been left in Rias' care. The group entered the building and found Rias and Aquino already inside. The table in the center of the room was laid out with food. For the rest of the group it would be a very good meal and produce some leftovers. But for Issei, he knew he could eat the whole lot and not even touch the sides of his stomach. Both girls sat on either side of the table, and as Issei walked in both indicated for him sit next to them. Issei chose a third option and sat an end of the table with both of them to either side of him. The food smelled amazing and Issei had to fight back his freshly growing saiyan urges to devour it all himself. Rias spoke first out of the group. "It is so good of you to join us today, Issei," her voice still as sweet as he had remembered it. Issei blushed slightly and scratched the back of his head. Unbeknownst to himself, it was something that made both the older girls think he was adorable. "Thanks for having me to lunch," he said in reply. He wasn't sure why, but her happiness to see him gave him tingles inside. The group began eating and Issei held himself back. He knew once he started then he would struggle to avoid inhaling up all of the group's lunch. Rias noticed his reluctance to eat and thought he may be off-put by the idea of eating devil's food. "It is quite safe for you to eat, Issei," she directed toward him while waving a hand invitingly to the spread. He looked to her and couldn't help but feel that she took his lack of eating as a personal rejection. Issei reached forward and took up a pork bun. It smelled divine. His mouth watered and he took a bite. The food was moist, succulent and cooked to absolute perfection. Issei knew there was no turning back now and proceeded to stuff himself. For the next few minutes he was oblivious to the world as consumed plate after plate of food. It was only when he noticed that no one else was reaching into the table that he stopped and looked around. Everyone was staring directly at him. Kiba and Aquino had stopped eating mid-bite and just stared with dumbstruck expressions and open mouths. Kaneko looked as if he had destroyed her appetite and Rias was simply shocked. Issei swallowed the food in his mouth and blushed heavily, feeling for all the world as the most embarrassed man on the planet. Well, you see, we Saiyans have pretty big appetites, he began, the words sounding ridiculous to himself. It felt a bit ridiculous that he could claim membership to a race he had been for less than 72 hours. The food is absolutely delicious though, he added in an attempt to make up for his complete lack of table manners. Even as a human, Issei hadn't been the most graceful eater. Now unfortunately that had been amplified 100-fold. Thank you, Rias replied slowly. She wasn't sure how much of a compliment it was when someone consumed the food that she and Aquino prepared that fast. Could he even taste the food, or did it just skip his tongue and fall directly into his belly? Issei pushed himself back from the table and reclined back against one of the couches. I might just move away from the food before I leave nothing left for the rest of you, he said with a sheepish grin. You could eat more? Aquino spoke up with a mixture of disgust, commendation and confusion in her voice. Well, yeah. Issei replied honestly. I don't ever seem to be full these days. The group looked unsure of how to proceed with that information but returned to eating their smaller portions. After a few minutes of silence, Rias addressed Issei, are you looking forward to your first assignment this afternoon? Definitely. Issei beamed at her, and he genuinely meant it. Although he would have been just as happy to stay here in the clubroom. It was an inviting place and he truly enjoyed being here. She smirked back to him and replied, good, meet back here immediately after class and we will all head out for it. I am sure we all want to see how you go with your first task. Her words seemed to leave a ring of mystery in the air. Issei looked around at the group. They all had subtle smiles on their face, even Kaneko. Issei was unsure if he should feel more excited or nervous now, but he didn't have to dwell on it for long as the bell to signal the end of the lunch period sounded, and so they all hopped up and made their way towards class as a group. When Issei asked who would clean up the mess, Rias simply replied that a Gremory housemaid would be along shortly to reset the clubroom. Issei looked at her and wondered just how wealthy her family was to have such people at her service. Once they made their way into the halls of the school building, everyone went off on their separate routes to their classes. Issei couldn't help but notice the jealous glares he received from other boys to have been walking and chatting in a group with Rias and Aquino. He thought it was silly though, both girls were very nice and if the boys wanted to talk with them that badly then they should just man up and do it. The remaining 3 periods passed slowly. They weren't difficult subject by any stretch of the imagination, Issei just couldn't focus on them. His focus was solely on his upcoming devil task. He had tried to work out what it could be by listening to the tasks that other members had done when they mentioned them, but each person seemed to do different things. Kiba was mostly hired by women that wanted the company of an attractive young man. Nothing ever untoward, just lonely housewives and single older women who wanted the compassionate ear he could provide. The fact that Kiba was a very attractive guy was something Issei was sure they enjoyed as well. Kaneko was often requested to perform for people or act as a maid or servant. Issei couldn't see why she would do it, she seemed so cold toward him and he couldn't imagine her accepting to be submissive to someone, but she was being paid so maybe she didn't care if there was good money was in the picture. Or maybe she just didn't like Issei. Aquino took jobs that mostly involved courting the wealthy and upper class. She would accompany them to functions or business events and present herself as someone that made her client seem highly desirable. Issei imagined that it probably took a fair amount of preparation for each job as she would need to understand what the goal that her client specifically wanted to achieve was and then present herself in such a way to allow that outcome. Finally, Rias hadn't mentioned any jobs and Issei was unsure if she would be required to do them. It was something he figured that he would ask her about when there was a bit of free time and they had gotten to know each other better. The bell sounded to signal the end of the school day. Issei leapt to his feet and bounded out of the classroom at a blistering pace. He reached the clubroom and looked around. He was the first one here. Maybe he hadn't needed to sprint here at such a fast pace. A pace in fact that had shocked even himself with the speed he could achieve. He wondered for a moment just how fast and strong he could become. Unlimited potential after all. But how unlimited was his unlimited potential exactly? Had Drake been literal, or had he used the term as an oversimplification? Issei waited for a few minutes and then decided to look at what was behind the other doors leading from the clubroom. The first and closest to the main entrance was a small washroom containing a toilet, bathtub shower combination, a basin and a vanity cabinet with mirror. That was good, as if Issei had needed to use the amenities he didn't want to have to head back to the main school building. The next doorway led to a small kitchenette with a stovetop, microwave, refrigerator and cupboards. A pantry at the far end. Issei resisted the urge to raid the fridge for food and moved to the last door that was furthest from the entrance. Opening it contained a set of stairs leading to the second floor. Issei pondered heading upstairs when he heard people entering behind him. He turned to see Rias, Akino, and Kaneko enter. The three girls chatting as they did so. Issei caught part of their conversation, and it seemed to be about the choices of accessories to go with matching shoes. Issei almost rolled his eyes as it appeared that even devil girls had an affiliation for fashion. The girls and Issei sat on the comfortable chairs and Rias addressed the group. Kiba won't be accompanying us today. He has had a different job request to attend to, she said with her chirpy voice. So if everyone could step into the circle, then we will get going. The group nodded as the crimson symbol of House Gremory appeared beneath Rias. It was large enough to have 7 or 8 people stand in it comfortably. More if you wished to be packed in like sardines. Issei was wondering why they were doing this, but didn't have to ponder for long. As soon as they were all inside the circle, it began to glow faintly, and then Issei saw the world pop, warp and change around him. 1 second they had been in the club room. Now they were in a dingy-looking alleyway with tall industrial-style buildings on either side. Whoa, he exclaimed, and Akino giggled at him. Was that your first time teleporting, Issei? She asked with a mischievous grin. Yeah, he replied back simply, completely dumbfounded that such an occurrence had just happened to him. Oh, and what else would be your first time? She followed up quickly. Lewdness dripping from her sultry voice. Issei blushed heavily and his mouth went dry as he tried to come up with a retort, but Rias spoke up, saving him. That's enough of that, Akino. This is nor the time or place. Her voice stern and disapproving. Akino pouted slightly at being scolded, but it was clear that she hadn't actually cared. Issei wondered if she was always like that towards everyone or just him specifically. Rias turned to Issei and looked him firmly in the eyes before speaking. I have been trying to work out what sort of job role would suit you and your skill set best. What I have come up with was inspired by the power I saw you use against the filthy Grigori before I reached you. The jobs I think you are best suited for would be hunting down rogue devils and fallen angel. She said the words as if they were the most simple of things. Issei had listened to everything she said intently for 2 reasons. Firstly, he was deeply interested, and secondly, he found himself transfixed in her eyes. They were the most beautiful oceanic aqua he had ever seen. He shook his head to clear those thoughts when she said hunt down rogue devils and fallen angels. What's a rogue devil? He asked, trying to shake off the urge to stare into her eyes again. He knew that the fallen angels were Grigori, but no one had mentioned rogue devils yet. They are devils who have turned from their masters. They now do as they please, but most often they become barbaric and little more than cannibalistic beasts that hunt humans or animals for sport or food. She spoke passionately, and Issei understood that she wanted to see these monsters rid of the world. They, like all devils, angels and supernatural beings, are given a rating for their power. The ratings begin at D level, then C through A and end with S. Each level is then broken down from 1 to 5, with 1 being the least potent and 5 the most powerful. Do you understand? Rias finished up her brief explanation and Issei nodded. Crazy monster. Needs to be killed. Rated from D1 to S5 in range of power, he summarized simply. Good, Rias simply answered with a smile that could melt a man's heart. Shall we get going? Wait a sec. Issei paused the group as they began to follow Rias. Everyone turned to him and he continued, "I can't fight in my school uniform. It is much too tight since I grew so rapidly. I can barely move my arms and legs." Akino began to snicker and then burst out with complete laughter. "Oh, issei, I can fix that easily," she said between bouts of laughter. She raised her hand and a deep blue energy with a yellow glow to it illuminated her hand and Issei's clothes. As the energy abetted, Issei found himself far more comfortable with the clothing having grown to fit him. Even his tail now came comfortably out of the top of his pants. He still kept it wrapped firmly around his waist though. Issei smiled genuinely toward Akino. "Thanks. That is so much better." They were so tight and uncomfortable. "I thought I might tear through them," he responded. Light group all chuckled and giggled at his comment. As all their laughter died down, Rias indicated for everyone to follow her. She held her left palm flat and parallel with the ground. As she did so, she mumbled a few words that Issei didn't catch and a small Gremory house symbol appeared in her hand. The stalk of the rose bobbing to and fro. Issei gathered what this was immediately. It was a compass and he could tell the stalk was leading the way to their target. That was a useful trick and it would be one he would definitely have to learn from her if he was able. Everyone was silent as they walked through the industrial complex. The buildings all appeared to have once been part of the automobile industry. That told Issei that they were in the abandoned industrial complex to the west of Kuo Town. His father had been a floor manager for one of the companies here before they became insolvent. Fortunately, he had been able to secure another position with a company that bought out part of the one he originally worked for. After less than 15 minutes of walking, they came to an old Toyota Industries warehouse. Rias motioned for everyone to come in close together. "All right everyone," she began in a whispered tone, "inside here is the rogue devil. Issei, would you rather be paired with Akino or Kaneko for this fight? Both are powerful and will ensure that you are safe so you can focus on showing us your fighting skills." Rias asked with a sincere tone to her whispers. Issei looked at her and shook his head. "No thanks. I will be fine alone. You can all just hang back and watch the fun." A cocky tone came to his low voice as his saiyan blood began to become excited at the prospect of a good fight. Rias looked at him disapprovingly. "I don't want you to be killed, Issei. Both Akino and Kaneko are skilled in battle and you may need their help," her whispers taking on a commanding tone. Both the referred to girls stood silently, but it was obvious that they both felt a little rejected at his dismissal of their strength. "Nah, it really is okay, Rias," Issei began. "This is my trial after all, right? I mean, if I am about to die, jump in by all means. But I think I will leave you all pleasantly surprised." Confidence dripped from his voice as he spoke. He knew he could do this. He had fought off a fallen angel when he was weak and basically a normal boy. Now he could run in heavy armor as if it were child's play and lift boulders that weighed more than he did. Probably up to twice his body weight. Not to mention his ability to produce his pure ki as a weapon. He hadn't practiced it, but he was positive that he could do it again. Rias looked as if she was going to continue arguing, but Kaneko whispered something into her ear. She paused with a contemplative expression before nodding to Issei and waving her hand for him to enter the building. A boastful smile spread across Issei's face as he stood and approached the large industrial doors that would usually be operated by hydraulics. The girls were unsure why he would be approaching them. They would most definitely be rusted shut and heavy beyond belief. He would need to find a window to climb in or something similar. Issei reached the door. With no visible handle present, he simply gripped onto the corrugated steel and with minimal effort, threw the door open. A great screeching, squealing sound echoed through the air as it slid down its rails at a pace faster than it ever had before. The rust that had bound it disintegrating under the force of the violent opening. To say the girls were impressed was a bit of an understatement, and Rias thought to herself, super strength, check. Issei walked casually into the spacious warehouse ground floor. Old conveyor belts led to machines that had either collapsed into ruin or been removed on the decommissioning of the factory. Very little filled the area. A small stairway led to a pair of offices on the second floor. Issei stood in the light that flooded the room through the entrance he had opened. A shuffling noise reached his ears and Issei turned to his right. A man of sorts came into his view. The left-hand side of the man's body was normal, but the right was mutated beyond belief. His skin looking burnt, blistered and melted. The whole side of the body moved as if it was gelatinous and non-soluble. A deformed wing sprouted from his right shoulder blade. His eyes a pale pink color with no iris visible. All of his skin on both sides of his body was covered in partially healed scratches and bites and was the color of spoiled milk. The devil opened its mouth and unleashed a horrendous sound. Issei had no words to describe how disgusting the noise was, only to say that it was enhanced by the disgusting state of the devil itself. The pitiful creature rushed toward Issei, clearly intent on making him the next meal it would have. Rias watched as the creature barreled at Issei. He wasn't moving. Was he frozen in fear? She was about to order someone to help, but the creature's deformed right hand shot out at Issei like elastic putty. However, just as it looked as if it would make contact with the stoic boy, Issei casually ducked to the right and stepped out of the way. His movements looked lazy and yet happened so fast. Just like in the fight against the fallen angel. Rias found that she had subconsciously been holding her breath. She released it and decided to allow Issei to have this fight if he could handle it. Issei watched as the creature's arm went over him. To his perception it was all happening incredibly slowly. He stood up and as the creature's momentum brought it in line with Issei, he raised a knee swiftly into its stomach. Blood and spittle shot from the mutated devil's mouth. The creature's disadvantage was enhanced as the force of the hit and the forward momentum of the charge caused its disfigured feet to leave the ground. Issei reached out with both his hands and grabbed a firm hold onto the creature by the midriff and armpit in a smooth motion that lifted it above his head. He squat slightly prior to leaping sharply into the air. He could feel the beast twist and squirm to strike him, but at the apex of his jump, almost reaching to the third-story level of the building, Issei threw the creature directly down below him toward the hard concrete ground. Blood splattered all across the ground as the devil struck. A gurgling sound coming from its deformed mouth. Issei landed nimbly beside it. The beast pushed itself into a crawling position. Issei merely watched as it slowly got to its feet. The logical part of his mind said to end the fight, but the primal saiyan side was enjoying this far too much. The creature clearly had broken ribs. They had burst from the impact of the landing and the right forearm had broken with part of the bone protruding through its skin, spilling blood all over the floor. Once again the beast threw its extendable gelatinous arm toward Issei, the hand clawed most likely to rake across him in a barbaric form of a slash. As before, time slowed as the appendage approached, ripping through the air toward him, and Issei stepped into the creature's guard. With its defense negated, he quickly closed the distance between the two. His right fist sinking into the devil's stomach with an uppercut. His left fist following up with a straight cross into the right side of the creature's face. As Issei brought his left hand back for another strike, he felt the pain of claws digging into his back. The creature's right claw had twisted around in an inhumane fashion and driven its talons into his back. Issei grimaced at the pain and grabbed the gelatinous hand in an over-grasp fashion with his left hand. He focused into himself and collected ki through his body and pulled it into his hand. He released the buildup of energy, which resulted in blood and bile spraying in arcs throughout the room as the ki released its brilliant flash of light. The extendable arm having been severed above the elbow. The devil staggered back and its talons fell away from the flesh of Issei's back to the floor. The creature howled in bouts of pain. Its left arm broken, right removed violently. Ribs broken and jaw shattered. Issei pounced and struck a right jab followed by a powerful straight kick from his left leg. The devil was launched off the ground and collapsed a few dozen feet away in a pitiful heap, still mewling and screaming. Issei approached the wretched pile and saw that it had landed in the area of the factory that it had been using as a main nest, so to speak. Half-eaten human bodies and bones lay around. The victims and food of the creature. Issei felt vomit threatened to come up at such a disgusting sight. This beast needed to be destroyed immediately. He raised both hands up with his arms extended and the right palm over the left. He concentrated and a raging ball of white-blue ki formed in his palm. The energy flared out wildly and threw light and shadows all over the dark areas of the building. He allowed the ball to build up to the size of a soccer ball before releasing it. As it struck its target, an explosion erupted. The devil and all the corpses that had fallen victim to it were disintegrated along with a large portion of the concrete flooring and part of the adjacent wall. His task complete, Issei turned and walked toward the outside world. The girl stood in the doorway Issei had opened and watched as he effortlessly demolished the rogue devil. It wasn't an immensely powerful beast. Its mindless state having diminished a lot of the power that it may have been able to wield, but it was still both awe-inspiring and scary to see such a junior member of the peerage fight so effortlessly. Rias had gasped as the talons of the devil raked into Issei's back. But what shocked Kaneko and Akino was the use of his ki. They had not seen him fight against Yuma. To see it disintegrate and sever limbs so easily was incredible. As Issei finished the fight, Akino turned to Rias. His ki could be as powerful as your destruction magic, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. Rias didn't answer her and didn't have to as Issei approached. The cocky grin still playing across his face. "Well, that's done," he stated in a carefree manner. He was trying his best to suppress the pain in his back. The talons had dug into his skin quite deeply and blood oozed into his now ruined uniform. "Yes, very well done," Rias replied. "You definitely were right to not need assistance," she continued. She was keeping her voice level. Inside, however, she was freaking out a bit at the level of power her had shown. Kaneko looked at Issei and in a plain voice spoke loudly to the group. "He is injured. I can smell the blood coming from his body." Her words came out in a flat voice as if she was stating simple facts. Akino moved quickly around before Issei could stop her and caught sight of his back, letting out a short gasp, causing the other two girls to move around him. "It's not so bad," he began, but Rias ordered him to stay still in a sharp tone. Issei did as he was told, allowing both Rias and Akino to inspect the wounds. Before Issei could make a suggestion, the Gremry crest appeared beneath them and the world flickered. They were back in the club room. "Lay down on a couch," Rias commanded. Her voice made it clear that she wouldn't argue and expected compliance. "It's really all right. I'll heal. I heal pretty quick, you know," Issei retorted in a voice that he hoped would sound stoic, but even he could hear the pain in his tone. Looking over, his eyes caught hold of Ria's face, and the look she held said that there was no arguing. Issei did as he was told and lay on the couch. His stomach to the material and face pushed to the side with his back upmost for whatever care was to come. Rias approached and created a tiny bead of magic that she swept across his clothes. The blazer and shirt he had been wearing vanished from his body and reappeared in a pile on the coffee table. His back had been raked by 4 long, deep slashes. The left-hand central one appeared the deepest. If she had suffered these wounds, she would have been screaming foul murder. Either Issei could take a lot of pain, couldn't feel the wounds, or was putting on a brave face. Rias wasn't sure which. As she examined the wounds, she couldn't help but notice that his back and arms were a lot more muscular than she had realized. The muscles looked almost as if they had been chiseled out of marble. Like the statue of an ancient Greek or Norse god. The way she expected them to look on Hercules or Thor. Rias felt Akino lean in next to her, and looking at her best friend, she saw the lewd look on Akino's face. She was admiring Issei's body too. "Can you repair his clothes?" she asked Akino as a way to move her away from Issei. She wasn't sure why, but she felt slightly uncomfortable with Akino looking at him in that way. Was it jealousy of her looking at Issei, or envy, or her looking at someone else? Akino smirked at her and released magic to repair the clothes without ever letting her eyes leave his body. The smirk of desire on her face said it all. "If you can look at him, then so can I." Rias rolled her eyes and got to work summoning ointments and bandages from the medical kit that sat in the bottom drawer of her desk. As the items came over, she applied them to Issei's skin. He never made a peep even as the ointment was smeared across the still open wounds. Once he was fully bandaged, Issei sat up into a seating position and both girls felt scarlet grace their faces. His torso and abdominal muscles were just as well defined as his back and arms. Issei felt awkward with the girls around him. Both Aquino and Rias looked at him sheepishly as they stood before him, and even Kaneko didn't meet his eye contact from her position on one of the adjacent couches. Issei grabbed his now repaired and blood-free clothes and dressed himself, moving with the bandages on caused pain to shoot through his body. As he covered himself up, the girl seemed to relax into a more natural posture, and Issei rose to his feet. "Well, I better be getting home," he said the words toward everyone and directed at no one in particular. It was not yet 6, but he felt like he should be leaving for home anyway. "Oh, I'll take you," Rias stated quickly. All eyes turned on her and she stammered for a second before continuing. "You are injured, and as a member of my peerage it is my responsibility to make sure you get home safely," her voice sounding uncertain as she spoke. Issei could swear he heard Aquino make a sound as if she didn't believe Rias. However, before anyone could interject, the Gremory crest appeared beneath both Issei and Rias. They were gone in a flash. Aquino smirked after her best friend had departed. Was the game on?